Okay, good to see you guys. This is Conrad at GOG Boxing, Grumpy Old Geezer Boxing, and today we're going to talk about pivots. Now, I did a video which I put up and then I took down. It was on pivots as compared to bumps, and what I did is I ended up kind of rushing through everything, and plus there's a lot of wind noise and stuff, although it was a really cool view. So I asked Roman to come back and help me, and we're just going to concentrate on pivots today, and then we'll get into bumps in the next video. And it's into some other fun things, because kind of rushing through to compare bumps and pivots, you know, I really didn't give pivots their just due or talk about some of the things that you need to do to actually be able to use pivots, right? Now, before we start, I'll just say, well, Roman, he's more from a kind of a kickboxing point of view, but that's okay, because this stuff does apply. But what we want to do first is, before we even start, if I'm going to line up, and if I'm here, because a lot of people don't understand pivots. They have a hard time, you know, just with actually slips. And as everybody knows, when you first start and you're just trying to slip and you're trying to get the timing down and you're trying not to wait too long and you slip too far, you don't slip far enough, you get hit. Well, then when you start trying to do pivots, that's where suddenly boxing becomes really, in some ways, the sweet science, because they're critical. But boy, they're hard to master, especially starting out without just getting plastered. I'm going to show you why and show you kind of the standard conservative type, or the go-to pivots, which is not even conservative, it's just a standard type pivots. And then some of the exercises you can do to help you get these pivots down, right? But first, let's if we line up, and why don't you stand right there for me, Roman? If we line up and we're boxing, right? We're boxing, and if I pivot wrong, let's say if I pivot wrong, and I'll give you an example of a wrong way to pivot, would be to pivot to actually my left without any kind of a step. The pivot doesn't do me any good. So if he was going to hit me with either his left or his right, and I pivot like this, what happens? I'm getting hit in the ear. I'm going to get knocked out. That doesn't mean that pivots won't work. Now I want you to look at me. If we just look at me at the camera, and look what happens if I'm here and I don't take a step at all. Look where my head is. I don't take a step at all, but I pivot. My head has moved out of the way of the oncoming punch. So if Roman's right there and I don't move at all, but I pivot, he missed me. Now, the problem is that you guys are going to know this. Even if I'm slipping, if you throw a punch and I slip, if I don't slip fast and if he's quick, I can get hit. Let me tell you, it is really hard to pivot fast enough on a jab. I mean, he's doing this slow, but if you get somebody out there that's got a fast jab and you're just trying to pivot out of the way from a static position, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. So what does this mean? What it means is we've got to figure out, first of all, how do you pivot? What's the right way to pivot so the pivot actually works? And second of all, how are we going to do it so we don't get clocked, right? Now, the first thing we're going to do is talk about, if we're standing here, and let's say that we're up close, okay? We're up close, and since we're both orthodox fighters, maybe come over here a bit so it's in, I know it's in the camera. We're both orthodox fighters. I'm not fighting lefty him, and so we're fighting over our foot position. Right now, we're orthodox and we're fighting right. A lot of times when you actually pivot, it's when you're pretty close in. If I'm far away, I mean, if I'm really fighting from the outside, yeah, I can pivot, but it doesn't necessarily give me much of an advantage. Okay, but if we're here, now come closer to me, we're here, and then he is going to throw that jab and I pivot off it, look at the position I'm in. Bam, I can hit him. He can't really hit me because of that punch. Even if we're even closer, let's say that we bumped, that we came right here, I can still pivot off that and he's there. Now, but you see what happens. He's not going to just sit there and let me pivot, and he's going to throw fast punches, right? It is very hard to pivot from a static position fast enough to get out of the way of the punch. It's very hard because we're static. But before we get into how we're going to manage this, I'll come back over here because I'm afraid we're getting out of the camera. If I'm going to pivot to this side, as I said, I can't pivot right here because he can hit me or he can hit me with the right hand. I'm not out of the way of anything, right? So what I'm going to have to do, come back over here closer. What I'm going to have to do is if I'm going to use a pivot to this side, to my left side, if I'm an orthodox fighter, I've got to step out before I even try the pivot. So actually come right here if you come on that side, okay? So this means we're here, and I'm fighting. I've got to, if I'm going to pivot to this side, I can't just pivot like that. It does me no good. I've got to step out to this side, so we'll just throw a straight punch. I've got to step out to that side, so here we go. I step out to that side, and actually, really what I'm probably not going to do, I'm not going to come all the way back around. I'm actually, on this, I'm fighting here. If I'm going to pivot to this side, I'm just going to take a little pivot out here. If I try to swing all the way back around, one, he's probably going to adjust. Two, look what happens. If I take that step and I try to swing, I'm coming back here. If he does adjust, step over here and hit me. Look, I'm going backwards. When he hits me, I'm in trouble. He's going to knock me on my butt, right? Because I've got this momentum swinging backwards into the thing. Now, you can say, well, do you have that on the other side? No, because if I'm on the other side, if I take a step or if I don't take a step, I'm stepping to my leverage side, okay? And in fact, if I step way around, he's got a hard time. If I can get around, I can even start doing the Lomachenko thing where he starts chasing people around behind him. But on this side, if I take that step and pivot out, if I go too far, it's easy to lose your balance. So what you end up doing is you need to try to make that step. So here we are, make that step. I'm going to go slow. That I'm stepping really outside of his foot before I make that pivot, okay? This all sounds really simple, okay? It's not. Because if we're sparring, and I pivot too slow, I get hit. If we're sparring and I step before I get the pivot off, I get blasted. If he adjusts while I'm trying to pivot, I get blasted. It is hard to do these pivots, especially when you're beginning, because one, you haven't done any sparring. Two, you'll be slow on the pivot. Three, you'll be probably kind of scared. And the one thing about pivots are if you're tense and thinking about it, for sure it's not going to work, right? So you're going to have to do some things to try to get those pivots to work. Trust me, they are really important and they do work. And to tell you the truth, in boxing, you're constantly doing little pivots, right? When you're boxing, you're lining up, you might shift to this side, you might shift, you're constantly doing little things anyway. Right? But when you're trying to do a pivot to put yourself in a position, either it's defense, but defense should lead to offense. So if I'm here and he throws a punch, I'm doing it so I can do something back. Okay? But obviously if I don't do it well, then I'm getting clocked. Now, how are we going to get to where we can actually get a quicker pivot, a faster pivot, and to actually get some practice in? That's where you get into practicing what I call, and this may not be the right way to term it, I call it kind of Mexican pivot drills because that's where I saw them actually under Mexican style trainers. And so you see, this is where you get this quadrant exercise, right? Now, again, let's just say I stand here in the middle right now. If I'm in a static position, right, and I try to pivot, one, it's hard, if I try to even pivot fast, it's hard to do fast in a static position without a step to that right side. I'm going to take a step when I do it to the other side, and in some ways that feels easier. Why? Because you're moving. There's a little bit of a move. But really, what you want to get, what you're going to want to practice is to get the ankle strength and to get that little twitch in. Okay, now to get the little twitch and to get a pivot on a small movement, what do? This is like in martial arts. You practice bigger movements to get to smaller movements, okay? So one thing that you will see, here's the X on the ground. You can also just put like just a ball or a shoe even if you want on the ground to practice. You will see drills that look like this. I'm in one quadrant, right? And then I slip, take a step, and I'm in the next quadrant. Slip and take a step, and I'm in the next quadrant. The same thing works if I'm in one quadrant and I step out and I come into the next quadrant. These types of quadrant drills, right? Now you say, well, is that type of a slip and pivot going to work? Yeah. Does it have its downside? Yeah, it does have its downside. So, but it's something that you practice. You practice to get where you can instantly do these slips and pivots, even if they're small movements. Now, before we get to the next step of that, though, we need to talk about what you really do when you pivot. You got to pivot on the ball of your feet, okay? Now, you think that's logical, but boy, I tell you, people try to do it, and they're all over the place. Guys that are used to fighting, or they're younger, and the amateurs, and they're used to this kind of boxing hop step, right, where you're always on your toes, and guys that play a lot of basketball. You know, it's amazing how many great boxers play basketball. Roy Jones played tons of basketball in his free time, Mayweather, whatever. You do get used to being on the balls of your feet and not being heavy and having your balance wrong. But for those of you that haven't, or maybe you're getting older, or you haven't been under an amateur coach, and so you're not used to fighting on the balls of your feet, let me give you just a couple of tips. It's funny how you get older, you feel this stuff. It's probably easier. If I'm here, and let's say that I'm just going to take a step pivot to the next quadrant right now, okay? So here I am. If I step onto my heel first, I'm not pivoting anywhere. My foot is glued to the ground. I can't pivot, right? If I step onto the ball of my foot, but my weight, then one thing, I'm vulnerable. Two, I'm not trying to do ballet, right? And it's not going to work. What you need to do is when you practice, whether you're in one place or not, but let's take a step right now to practice. You take this step pivot, you step to the ball of your foot. Your weight does have to go to your front foot, but just for a second so that you can turn. Just for a second. You don't want to put too much weight on that front foot. The same thing is if I'm here and I want to step to this side, step around his outside foot. I'm stepping onto the ball of my foot. For a second, my weight, obviously it's there, but really what I'm doing is a small pivot to this side, but my weight is going back into this stance where, let's say there's 60-65% of your weight on your back foot and your front foot. Same thing here. I'm here, I take the step onto the ball of my foot, I pivot, but I'm back on with more of my weight on my back foot in this stance. And this is something that you have to practice. If you haven't played basketball, for example, or some sports where you needed to pivot around, then it's not going to come naturally. And what certainly is not going to come naturally is now just being in one stance here, whether you're moving or not, but just standing straight up and suddenly trying to pivot out in time. So how do we do that? Okay, now that you understand how to pivot, and remember to do it on the ball of your foot and also not to lock your weight on that foot. Now we got to think about how we're going to do this. Well, now we get back to the big movements, pivots, okay? And I'm going to give you some exercises to help you with your ankle strength and everything to help you do that. Because if you don't have good ankle strength, you can't do pivots and you don't have good balance. But now, if I practice, if I'm here, and look what happens if I take this big step to the next quadrant, right? To the next quadrant, and then I pivot off it. Well, it's natural. What I want to do is like in a slip position. Slip, take the step, and come out, right? If I'm over here and I want to step, actually I kind of should have drawn this quadrant a little bit to the side, but okay. If I'm here and I want to do it here, it's like a slip here, but with a step, and then I'm out, okay? Now what happens? What really spins me on the pivot is not just my ankle tendons, right? It's this spring action. So if I'm here without taking a step, and even if I do a small spring, I can step out. Now I should take a step on this side, but let's say I don't. If I cock the spring, that's what swings me out. If I cock the spring this way, that's what swings me out. If I step, a bigger step, it's more natural, it's easier to practice and to get used to it. So I'm here, I step, and I spring out, because that step is a bigger, loaded spring, right? The same thing to this side, that step, you see how my body's twisted? That step out around his back foot so that I don't get clocked is a spring, and I'm out, okay? Now, again, you guys know I'm a fan of bumps. from the kind of the Kenny Weldon School. We'll talk about that. This still isn't super fast, but if you practice these quadrants, right, these types of step move pivots, it will help you when you have to make smaller pivots, because you'll get where you can do a quick, smaller cock spring movement to get out. Now, if Roman comes back, I want to show you what it looks like with both. So maybe stand there so I know we're in the camera. Now, if we're here and we're somewhat at a distance and he wants to throw that jab, yeah, what I can do is step outside of that foot and spring around, okay? And actually, I can do that pretty fast. You throw it a little faster, bam. I can do it. Well, I actually went before he threw the punch. But if we're here, he throws the punch, well, throw the punch on me, okay? Okay, here he throws the punch, bam. Now, that actually illustrated something. I didn't get my foot outside of his foot, which is the point I was going to get to. But let's do it first. Don't jump forward. You're just here. They're just here. So I step out. Okay, ready? One more time. Bam! I stepped out. Okay. Now, it's not easy to do, and even now I'm talking. But if I had a little bit more movement, he throws the jab. It's definitely possible to do. The same thing. If he's over here and we move it, I get out here and I spin out a small pivot, and then I can hit in. Do that again. Bam. See, I'm here, and I can do it again. But what happens? Why, you say, oh, well, that's how you should pivot all the time. This step to the other quadrant, right? Or this step out here to the other quadrant. The problem with that gets into your knees. And here's what happens. He's moving, I'm trying to fight. If I'm trying to step out, but I'm going too slow, I'll do just what we did a second ago. One, probably our knees will hit. Come in, bam. And believe me, that hurts when that happens. That actually kind of hurt right then. But what we do, then look what I can't do anything. We bumped, I'm stuck, I'm not in a pivot, I don't have any balance or anything. Okay? Same thing is if I'm here and I go too slow, one, I get hit, I'm already going backwards, etc. So the quadrant drill is a drill to teach you, and the step slip pivot is a drill to practice, right? But we have to be realistic that it's not always going to work. One, you can definitely bash your knees. Even if you manage to do it, right, you can wind up, if you do it, let's say I managed to do it, but I do it slow. So if you throw that one, I came out here, but instead of just missing me, because people aren't just going to throw and give up, he follows me around and I'm slow, so I step. Now he follows me around. I've got him on my back because I've still given him my ear. Now I don't want him to, don't hit me in the back of the head. But you see, now I'm in the Lomachenko zone, but on the wrong side, right? Because if he throws that and I go slow and he follows me around, I'm trying to defend myself and he's already got, I'm in a bad position. So that's a problem when we get into these types of slips that are step out slips. They might look cool, they're fun to practice, but it's hard to do. Better, the more you practice, we're fighting, and I can just make that instant slip. But that instant slip, do that again, that instant slip might have looked as if it was from a static position. But what I was really doing was a tiny spring cock to get myself out. How do you get that? Well, you get that from practicing these. But you have to remember what you're practicing for. Same thing if we're here, and he throws that side. I do need to get my foot out. So this is a step. It's a step. But it's practicing this movement so that I can get out. Now that means we got to practice big movements to be able to do small movements, right? Clear? It's pretty clear. Now, let me show you a couple of exercises really quickly